Right now, the person you love wants to share something crucial with you. Kindly read this message right now. Something within of them was no longer able to remain silent. They looked at the screen, typed a sentence, deleted it, got up from the chair, went to the window, returned, and tried again. It wasn't a dramatic message. It wasn't really loud. But for some reason, it had the weight that could subtly alter two people's lives forever. The distance between you wasn't measured in kilometers at that very time, and they said, if they only knew why I've waited this long. It was quantified in unspoken words. What was so crucial that it couldn't wait another day? Hold on, for the solution starts where no one was looking. With the exception of the gentle buzz of the evening outside, the room was nearly silent. They were waiting with their phone in their hands, unlocked. They opened your communication every few seconds, read your last message one more, grinned briefly, and then averted their gaze, perhaps gathering the bravery they had been looking for innumerable sleepless nights. They hadn't forgotten you. It wasn't because they were no longer concerned. It was because some truths weigh more the longer they are kept a secret. They came to see that every justification, postponed response, and incomplete exchange had subtly erected a wall that neither of you had intended to build. Then an unforeseen event occurred. They stopped justifying their silence after having a straightforward discussion with someone they trusted. They kept asking themselves the same question. What happens if you don't inform them till tomorrow? The atmosphere was entirely altered by that one thought. Their faces softened. The room seemed to be drowned out by the sound of their hearts. For the first time in a long time, they began to consider speaking honestly rather than trying to say the ideal thing. Nearly everyone overlooks one minor element, and it's closer than you might think. Far distant. Unbeknownst to you, an ordinary day was about to become spectacular. Nothing appeared unusual in your immediate surroundings. Cars kept going by. People grinned, rushed, chuckled, and continued with their daily activities. However, another choice was subtly taking shape somewhere outside of the familiar. They opened an old picture that brought back memories of a vow they had never made out loud but had also never forgotten. The memories were not unpleasant reminders. They come one by one like soft lights flickering on, demonstrating to them that every deep connection has a point at which it is difficult to remain silent. One memory held their attention longer than the others, and all of a sudden they realized what had been lacking. It wasn't a chance. It had nothing to do with timing. It was bravery. The guts to acknowledge that some people leave lasting impressions on your heart that don't go away. They inhaled deeply and gazed at the blinking cursor as though it were the opening to a whole new chapter before pressing another key. The events that followed would show why this message could no longer be kept secret, and the initial words they ultimately decided on were completely unexpected. Almost immediately after the first sentence appeared on the screen, it vanished. Before anyone could ever read it, they erased it. Not because it wasn't accurate, but rather because it didn't fully convey what they had been suppressing. Once more, their fingers remained motionless above the keyboard as innumerable feelings subtly fought for a spot in a single message. They considered every scenario. What if you didn't understand? What if you had already made progress? What if there had been a bit too much silence? However, a different voice within them resisted allowing dread to triumph this time. It served as a reminder that sincere statements are rarely the source of the worst regrets. The words we never speak are what make them. Another sentence emerged slowly. This one is harder to mimic, softer, and more real. It wasn't an attempt to win you over. It was not an attempt to change the past. It merely conveyed a reality that was becoming more and more powerful every day. They wanted you to know that every delayed response was the result of a mental dialogue they had practiced hundreds of times. There was a heart waiting for the perfect occasion behind every silent moment. Every unanswered question was motivated by the same straightforward desire to reveal to you the side of themselves that they had been keeping hidden for far too long. Remain near. Because the next choice explains why today is different from all the days that came before it. Nearly simultaneously, an entirely unanticipated change occurred in their surroundings. Outside, the world carried on as usual. However, everything felt oddly lighter inside. They came to the realization that protecting what really mattered was more important to them than shielding themselves from disappointment. Everything was altered by that insight. The message gradually changed from ambiguity to candor. Each sentence became more understandable. Every word seemed more vibrant. They concentrated on sharing every emotion they had been reluctant to share rather than explaining every error. They acknowledged that some people come into your life so subtly that you don't realize right away how profoundly they have altered your destiny. You become used to their company, their generosity, and their talks until one day you consider losing them, at which point everything else seems insignificant. That was the insight that was now in front of them. They grinned and briefly closed their eyes before sending anything. It wasn't because they knew what would happen next, but rather because they felt liberated enough to quit acting indifferent. If this story has already moved you, think about telling it to someone who still thinks that meaningful words have the power to transform lives. And share the thing that has stuck with you the most in the comments section. Honest conversations can inspire one another at times, and the subtle ripple effect can go far beyond anyone's expectations. Then the time arrived that neither of you had anticipated. The cursor stopped flashing. Their hands had stopped shaking. A serene certainty that startled even them gradually took the place of all the apprehension that had pervaded the room only minutes before. When they took one last glance at the message, they saw something extraordinary. It wasn't flawless. It was not poetic. Dramatic promises did not build it. It was genuine. And sometimes the power of reality surpasses that of perfect words. They had another notion just before they hit submit. A notion that prompted them to include one last line at the end. The past was not the subject of that one sentence. It has nothing to do with today. It was about everything that might still occur if both hearts opted for truthfulness over presumptions. They were aware that there would be no going back once the message had left their phone. But for the first time, they were not afraid of that prospect. It gave them hope. You might not have realized it, but you were getting closer than ever to reading the words they thought would finally explain everything. And there was one silent confession tucked away in the final line. The one they had held off on telling the longest. The one that would fundamentally alter the significance of each preceding stillness. Another recollection suddenly came to mind as the message was ready to be sent. It wasn't the most dramatic or significant moment you had ever shared. To everyone else, it was practically invisible. A few simple remarks that sounded typical at the time, a gentle grin, and a little chat. However, neither of you knew the full significance of that little recollection. They eventually realized why it had never faded as they gazed at it in their minds like they were viewing an old movie. It served as a reminder that big gestures are rarely used to establish true bonds. Moments that most people miss help them grow. That insight turned out to be the final component they had been looking for. They chose to tell you the truth, one truthful statement at a time rather than attempting to explain everything at once. The need to conceal oneself behind well-chosen words or flawless timing has vanished. They wanted you to see what was truly on their minds. They felt deep down that you deserved nothing less. The next decision they made showed something even more unexpected than the message itself, so pay attention. Instead of putting the phone away right away, they observed the screen motionless while slowly pressing the send button. Nothing happened for a few long seconds. Stretching far beyond the room surrounding them, the silence had an almost theatrical quality. However, something extraordinary occurred within their hearts during that quiet. They came to the realization that they were no longer holding out for the ideal answer. They weren't expecting perfect words in return. The most important thing was to eventually replace uncertainty with honesty. Like clouds drifting away from the morning sky, the weight they had been carrying for so long started to gradually lift. They started breathing more steadily. Their shoulders eased. Outside, even the everyday sound seemed lighter. They somehow realized that some communications are never intended to manipulate someone else's emotions. They exist merely because it is right to speak the truth. Then they had another unanticipated concept. What if there was more to this discussion than just showing love or gratitude? What if it also meant allowing you both to let go of unresolved questions? They felt a quiet optimism they had never felt before because of that potential. In a very long period. However, there was still one information that they had withheld, one that was concealed between the lines and awaiting the ideal opportunity to come to light. The phone vibrated after that. It was not the response they anticipated. It wasn't even a complete answer. It was a much little thing, but it had far greater significance. A straightforward indication that the communication was received. An uncontrolled smile gradually spread across their face as their eyes grew wide. The world appeared to stop around them for a split second. Suddenly, the doubt that had prevented this talk seemed so insignificant compared to the hope that was beginning to bloom inside. They took their time picturing the conclusion. They did not impose expectations on the future. Rather, they were grateful that the stillness had finally been broken. That was the true start. It was the bravery that produced the message, not the message itself. And as they glanced out the window once again, they muttered to themselves that they would never again let fear triumph over honesty, no matter where this path took them. However, you were both unaware that a different discourse had already started somewhere else. A discussion that would reveal one last reality that neither of you anticipated, making the significance of that message even more significant than anyone could have predicted. Another quiet talk was going on while you were still in the dark about all that was happening behind the scenes. It wasn't anticipated. It wasn't practiced. It happened organically, as though the appropriate words had just been waiting for the proper opportunity. When someone glanced at them, they instantly saw something was unusual. A calm confidence that had never existed before had taken the place of the hesitation that had once been written across their face. With a knowing smile, the person added, "You finally said it, didn't you?" They didn't answer right away. Instead, they looked down for a second, smiled quietly, and nodded. That one action spoke more than any explanation could. They acknowledged that it was now far more taxing to carry significant emotions in silence than to speak openly. The peculiar thing was that they didn't feel weaker when they revealed their truth. They had a lighter feeling. The relief of being real at last seemed to outweigh all the fears they had imagined for weeks. If you're curious what will happen next in this narrative, you might want to share it with someone who appreciates stories like this. If you want to go on future cinematic adventures with us, please subscribe and leave a comment about the moment that most shocked you. But the next finding would show why this communication had come at the right time. In the meantime, they discovered that they were reading your previous exchanges once more, but this time it felt different. The identical phrases took on new significance. The same intervals between messages were no longer perceived as being far apart. They appeared to be times when both hearts silently hoped the other would move forward. Little details they had previously missed made them happy. A straightforward query you had posed, a polite remark you most likely didn't give much attention to, and a considerate response that had lingered in their minds far longer than you could have ever dreamed. All of a sudden, they realized something lovely. Long after forgetting the precise words spoken, people frequently recall how they felt around someone. Everything revolved around that realization. What had gone wrong was no longer what they wanted to think about. From everything that had silently gone well, they intended to construct something. There was no longer a sense of mystery and uncertainty about the future. Rather, it seemed like an unwritten chapter that was just waiting to be written by two sincere people. They thought this conversation had come at the perfect moment because, just when it appeared that the greatest truth had already been exposed, another surprising detail subtly emerged. They went outdoors and gazed at the horizon as the dusk gradually gave way to night, allowing the refreshing air to calm their minds. They weren't questioning whether they had done enough for the first time in a long time. They weren't reviewing previous exchanges or looking for more appropriate terms. All they could do was be thankful for the end of the silence. Even though it appeared to be a calm period, they were unable to resist one last insight that was becoming more and more apparent to them. There had never been a single text that included the crucial message they wanted you to read. It was bigger than that. It was a pledge to give up hiding behind reluctance, to cherish open discussions before chances slip by in silence, and to value the infrequent relationships that make everyday days seem extraordinary. Another notification arrived on the screen just as they were putting their phone back in their pocket. It wasn't very long. Although it wasn't dramatic, the first few words immediately altered their facial expressions by implying that a deeper conversation was just getting started. And neither of you could have predicted how those next words would alter the course of this tale. They didn't check the notice for a few seconds because they wanted to cling to that uncommon sense of possibility for a bit longer rather than because they were terrified of what was within. Suddenly, the peaceful evening surrounding them felt different. There seemed to be eagerness in every passing air. They tapped the screen at last. The response was brief, but it was clearly sincere in every word. It did not linger on the silence, it just acknowledged it. Without placing blame, it acknowledged the distance. Above all, it did not close a door, rather, it opened one. They read the message many than once, each time picking up on a little element that was concealed between the lines. Where they had anticipated uncertainty, there was kindness. Where they had dreaded disappointment, there was understanding. They became aware of something remarkable at that very instant. The most significant discussions don't always start with flawless responses. They start with two individuals deciding to be truthful at precisely the same moment. Noise does not bring down the walls erected by doubt. One honest sentence after another, they vanish silently. Give this a little more thinking because you're about to come to a conclusion that will completely alter your perception of what this message was really about. Neither of them hurried to make big promises or dramatic statements as the conversation went on. Rather, they found something far more valuable. There was a slight increase in trust with each successive communication. It was suddenly easy to ask questions that had previously seemed impossible. Without any effort, laughter entered the conversation. The pauses were no longer uncomfortable. They experienced a sense of calm, as if quiet had become an asset rather than a barrier. They talked about unforeseen recollections, long-forgotten dreams, and the times that had subtly molded them while life continued on. It became evident that both hearts had been secretly harboring similar aspirations. One had been waiting for bravery. The other had been awaiting clarification. At last, they had both come together. The amazing thing wasn't that everything became flawless right away. It was that they no longer felt the need to conceal themselves. They realized that sincere relationships become stronger when honesty replaces presumptions rather than when life gets easier. But beneath the surface, there was still one last reality. A reality that reinterpreted everything that had transpired from the start. They reflected on the initial message that had initiated the conversation just before it naturally came to an end. It was quite inconceivable that everything that followed had been made possible by a few heartfelt words. They grinned, understanding that the crucial lesson had never been about crafting the ideal moment or using perfect phrase. It had always been about picking bravery over hesitation, transparency over doubt, and hope over countless hypothetical scenarios. It was more than just a confession that they wanted you to read right away. It was an exhortation to allow significant words come out of the heart. Because there comes a time in every friendship, relationship, and lasting connection when being honest marks the start of something new. They felt a calm certainty they had never known before as they put down the phone and took one more glance at the horizon. The beauty of the future lay in the fact that it was still unwritten, clear's throat. Some stories conclude with every solution previously known. This one had an even better conclusion. The assurance that the next chapter would be written together, starting with the message that eventually reached you, one sincere discussion at a time.